What's going on, Blitz team? So we continue on with the top 10 video series, and in this top 10 video, we're going to talk about the top 10 teams Michael Jordan's Bulls beat in the NBA playoffs and NBA finals. Now, this is a big one because there's been a lot of people trying to rewrite history and some folks just looking for excuses for their favorite player or confirmation bias, and they've tried to run down an entire decade of basketball. So I'm going to give you my top 10 teams that Michael Jordan beat and why with each team. But before we get into the actual list, I have a few things that I want to share with you right off the bat here. Now, we're going to start out, a lot of people talk about the modern day Golden State Warriors. Well, just to kind of show you how great the competition was in the 90s, let's go to the 1991 Golden State Warriors. And you can see on your screen, very comparable team. You had three guys averaging basically 23 with Tim Hardaway or higher, which is more guys averaging over 23 or at 23 and higher than the Golden State Warriors. And you can see that these teams are very comparable, especially from an offensive standpoint. Now, what if I told you that Golden State Warriors team, the Run TMC Warriors, was eliminated in the second round of the playoffs by the Los Angeles Lakers 4-1, and then the Lakers would go on to lose to the Bulls in the NBA Finals. This team didn't even get to the conference finals. They didn't even get to the Western Conference Finals. So yeah, do I have your attention now? Speaking of the 1991 NBA playoffs, Michael Jordan's Bulls beat teams with players with the following career achievements. Let's say that we took their legacies and put them all together. 8 Hall of Famers, 4 NBA MVP awards, 6 Finals MVPs, 2 Defensive Player of the Years, 47 NBA championship rings, and 5 All-Star MVPs. These are the players that the 91 Bulls went through to get to that championship. And when you're talking about quality of opposition, there's no team that's a better shining example of quality of opponent and opposition than Michael Jordan's championship Bulls. And as you can see on your screen, the collective win percentage of playoff opponents, and these are title teams who played at least 4 rounds, so when the playoffs became 4 rounds and on. And you can see that the 1997 Chicago Bulls had the second hardest road to a championship. The 1993 Bulls, the 5th hardest road. The 1998 Bulls, the 10th hardest road. The 1996 Bulls, the 14th toughest road to a title. And we're talking about, you're going way back with these comparisons. Number of years here. And the 1992 Chicago Bulls, the 22nd hardest road to a title. So that was a summary of the competition that Michael Jordan faced in the playoffs. And you can see that's elite stuff. Now, let me show you some more. You had, here's the championship teams. Now, these are title teams with the lowest scoring supporting casts for the overall playoffs. This is post-1954. Now, this is the combined scoring of the teammates past the leading score. So you can see the 98 Bulls, Jordan had the worst supporting cast of all time. 97, the second worst. 92, the 5th worst. 96, the 6th worst. In 93, the 8th worst supporting cast for scoring of all time for championship teams. So as you can see, Michael Jordan's supporting cast wasn't great at supporting him as compared to other championship teams. Now let's put this back on the screen right here. And you can see, look at the bottom right corner. The 90s Bulls have the most spots in the top 10 with 3. The most spots in the top 10 with 3. That means they had the toughest competition of all time. And then the 90s Bulls and 2000s Lakers have the most spots in the top 15 with 4 apiece. Oh, wow. Kobe and Jordan. Obviously, Kobe, as you can see, had a better supporting cast than Michael Jordan did, though. Now, let's tie these two together. Okay? So, what does all of this mean? It means Michael Jordan led the Bulls to a championship against the second toughest road to a title in 1997 with the second worst scoring supporting cast. Flu game, anyone? Remember that 97 championship run? Michael Jordan led the Bulls to a championship against the fifth toughest road to a title in 1993 with the eighth worst scoring supporting cast. Michael Jordan led the Bulls to a championship against the 10th toughest road to a title in 1998 with the worst scoring supporting cast. Michael Jordan led the Bulls to a championship against the 14th toughest road to a title in 96 with the sixth worst scoring supporting cast. And Michael Jordan led the Bulls to a championship against the 22nd toughest road to a title in 1992 with the fifth worst scoring supporting cast. Yeah, kind of debunks the narrative, doesn't it? Continuing on. In the shot clock era, Jordan has 5 of the 8 lowest scoring playoff supporting casts for title teams. 5 of the 8 lowest. 4 of the 6 lowest. And 3 of the 5 lowest. And he has the 2 lowest scoring playoff supporting casts for championship teams. Jordan is the only player to lead multiple top 10 lowest scoring playoff supporting casts among title teams. So do I have your attention now? And adding to that, Michael Jordan beat the MVP, the runner-up to MVP, which he won, right? So the next best player, or the Defensive Player of the Year in 1996 in every NBA Finals appearance. Let me say that one more time. He beat the MVP from that season, the runner-up to his MVP, or Defensive Player of the Year 96 in every NBA Finals appearance. Michael Jordan's series record against 50-win teams was 20-7. And his series record against 60-win teams was 7-2 in the NBA playoffs. And maybe I'll give you you-know-who's record at the end of the video. But let's get in to the top 10 teams that Michael Jordan's Bulls beat in the NBA playoffs. 10. Number 10, I'm going with the 1997 Miami Heat. So Pat Riley, who worked his magic with the Lakers, he worked his magic with the Knicks, and he worked his magic with yet another team that Michael Jordan would face, and it was the 90s Heat. He turned this team into one of the most underrated defensive teams of all time. They were number 1 in the NBA in defensive rating that year. Now, they won 61 games, even though Alonzo Mourning missed 16 games that year. They had All-Star Tim Hardaway, who racked up 5 All-Star appearances in his career with 5 All-NBA selections. They had Hall of Famer Alonzo Mourning, who became a 7-time All-Star and NBA champion. You guys remember when he filled in for Shaq in the 2006 NBA Finals. He had 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards and a 2-times blocks champion. You had Jamal Mashburn, who would become a 1-time All-Star and a 1-time All-NBA guy. They also had Thunder Dan Marley, who could still light it up and catch fire at this stage of his career. He was past his peak, but still pretty good. And Tim Hardaway, who finished 4th in NBA MVP voting that year. Alonzo Mourning finished 12th in NBA MVP voting. You had Isaac Austin, who finished 7th in 6th Man of the Year voting, and he won the NBA's Most Improved Player award. You had Vashawn Leonard, who finished 4th in Most Improved Player voting. So this was a tough, grinded-out type series. Buckets were not easy to come by. Michael Jordan averaged 30 and 8, and he had to score in volume. This is something that you saw in the second three-peat years, where he'd have to put the team on his back and just start gunning. Scottie Pippen, he was the only other Bull in double-digit scoring in the series, and Scottie averaged more turnovers than assists in the series. So this was a physical 90s knockdown, drag-out, street fight style series. And at 33 years old, Michael Jordan led the Bulls to an Eastern Conference Finals win and another NBA Finals appearance. So I've got the 97 Heat at number 10.
9,
At number 9, I'm going with the 1998 Indiana Pacers. There's some people that sleep on the 98 Pacers. There's some people that I think put them a little too high as far as Michael Jordan opponents. They took the Bulls to 7 games. Now, I read that Skip Bayless puts this as the best team the Bulls beat, and I would definitely disagree with that. As you can see, I've got them at number 9. But they were 5th in defensive rating that year and 4th in offensive rating. You had a well-balanced team. You had Hall of Famer and a guy who would become a 5-time All-Star in Reggie Miller, of course, one of the best three-point shooters of all time. You had Rick Smits, who was an All-Star that year. They had Dale Davis, who became an All-Star just 2 years later. They had Mark Jackson, who was 1 year removed from leading the league in assists, and there were some good point guards in the league at the time. They had Antonio Davis, who became an All-Star 3 years later. They had Hall of Famer Chris Mullin, who was a 5-time All-Star. They had Derek McKee, who had 2 All-Defensive Team selections. This was a deep team, and they went deep into their rotation, even in the playoffs, which most coaches shorten up their rotation, but they went deep into the rotation in the playoffs. And let's not forget, just a couple years later, they held Kobe to 37% shooting in the 2000, or 36% shooting in the 2000 NBA Finals. Scottie Pippen himself struggled against this Pacers team, shooting only 39%. And they even held Dennis Rodman to less than 10 rebounds per game. Michael Jordan, well, he put up 32, 6, and 4 on 47% shooting, and once again willed the Bulls to a series win in a great series. And you guys remember the proclamation, the prediction before Game 7. He led the Bulls to a win over this deep Indiana Pacers team, even though a lot of his teammates were getting outplayed on a game-by-game basis. So I've got the 98 Indiana Pacers at number 9.
8,
At number 8, I'm going with the 1993 New York Knicks. Now, the Knicks were becoming much more consistent in Pat Riley's system, and they were playing a very physical brand of basketball. During the regular season, the Knicks were an up-and-down team in 1992, but by the time the 92 playoffs rolled around, they were playing elite defense and very physical basketball. And you saw in 1993, they became more consistent during the regular season specifically, and they won 60 games in Pat Riley's system. And let's not forget, this is the Knicks team that took a 2-0 series lead on the Bulls. Bulls had to battle back. And let's not forget that ridiculous 54-point game for Michael Jordan in Game 4. Now, Patrick Ewing, he dominated the Bulls' bigs. You had John Starks, Anthony Mason, and Charles Smith, all average double-digit scoring in the series. And, of course, the forte of this team was defense. They had great length. You had imposing bigs on the court like Ewing, Mason, Smith, and Oakley. You had John Starks, Doc Rivers, and Greg Anthony handling the playmaking duties on this basketball team. Anthony Mason would become an all-star later in his career. Charles Oakley was a 2-time all-star. John Starks was an all-star the following year. Doc Rivers was a 1-time all-star. Patrick Ewing was 4th in NBA MVP voting that year. You had John Starks and Charles Oakley were tied for 5th in Defensive Player of the Year voting. Anthony Mason was tied for 2nd in 6th Man of the Year voting. And John Starks was 4th in Most Improved Player voting. So yeah, this was a good team, to say the least. When we're talking about physically imposing teams like the New York Knicks, stats don't do justice. If you watch this team play, if you watch the series, only film does justice. This was a bruising street fight type of basketball team. They won games through physicality, through intimidation, and through brute force. So you had this physical, punch-you-in-the-mouth type basketball team, And you only had Scottie Pippen and B.J. Armstrong as far as the other Bulls to score in double digits in the series. Michael Jordan led the way by putting up 32, 6, and 7 against a defense that was just locked in on stopping him when you could be more physical and you could impose your will defensively with physicality in that era. This was such a tough challenge for Michael Jordan, but he led the Bulls to another series win, put the team on his back, and got the job done once again. So I've got the 93 Knicks at number 8 on my list.
7.
Man, at number 7, I'm going with the 1992 New York Knicks. So I had 93 at 8, 92 at 7. Now, if you just looked at their records, you wouldn't rank them this way. And stats do not do the 92 Knicks justice. There's a reason this team took the Bulls to 7 games that year, and it was physicality. It was the most physical defense the championship Bulls faced. And yes, even more physical than the bad boy Pistons, and even the bad boy Pistons of the 80s. I'd say this team was more physical. The leader of the Knicks, of course, Hall of Famer Patrick Ewing, 11-time All-Star in his career. He averaged 24 points, 11 rebounds, 3 blocks per game that season. He was 5th in NBA MVP voting. He had Xavier McDaniel, who you see on the screen in the background behind me. He was an All-Star in 1988. He averaged 19 and 6 in the series against the Bulls. John Starks was an All-Star in 94. He was 4th in voting for 6th Man of the Year award that year, 6th in Most Improved Player voting, and he had an all-defensive selection the following year in 93, along with being tied for 5th in DPOY voting the following year. The Knicks were trading off self-professed Jordan stopper Gerald Wilkins, who in my opinion is the absolute most underrated perimeter defender in NBA history. But they were trading off Gerald Wilkins and John Starks defending Michael Jordan. So Pat Riley was sending both of those guys at Michael Jordan, subbing them in and out for each other. And they were always fresh when they were defending Michael. And these are both great on-ball defenders. You had Mark Jackson at the point, who was an All-Star in 89, led the league in assists in 97. He was the perfect point guard for that team. And they also had 2 beast enforcers when you're talking about Charles Oakley and Anthony Mason, who just made you pay for going to the basket. And Michael Jordan was held to primarily jump shots in this series. And even during the broadcast in the series, they were putting up graphics on the screen showing you how he couldn't get to the basket. He only had 1 attempt at the rim. All jump shots throughout the series in these different games. They had that graphic on the screen. It was just an incredible defensive performance by this Knicks team. The Chicago Bulls versus New York Knicks 1992 NBA playoff series is my absolute favorite playoff series of all time because it was so physical. The crowds were amazing. It was so hard to score. This was grinded out street fight type basketball. That's why it drives me nuts when people talk about the competition in the 90s. Michael Jordan had to earn it against teams like this. When basketball fans overly simplify what a great team is with these arguments about, oh, this team had all-stars and blah, 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 they clearly don't understand what made the 90s so tough. To me, that's more of an indictment on their knowledge than it is the competition. You know, the pampered superstars of today, I got to tell you, a lot of them would fold in the face of the physicality that we saw out of that 92 Knicks team in that series against the Bulls. Guess who didn't? Michael Jordan. He met that physicality head on. Led the way with 31 points per game on 48% shooting with only 2 teammates averaging double-digit scoring. Scottie Pippen looked afraid to go to the basket until Game 7. Afraid. The Knicks had 4 guys in double-digit scoring in the series, and Michael Jordan willed the Bulls to the 7-game series win in the face of extremely physical competition. If you put that 1992 Knicks in a time machine and you had them face any team from this era, people would say, well, some of these teams would just shoot over them. You don't understand how far they weren't just physical at the rim. They'd get physical on you on the perimeter. They'd be bodying up these guys out behind the three-point line. And I recall a certain Steph Curry struggling with physicality in the NBA Finals. Oh, yeah, with Matthew Dellavedova guarding him. You let them play that physical brand of basketball, this 92 Knicks team, man, the basketball world would be in for a huge surprise if they saw this team playing against some of the finesse teams of today. But yeah, that Knicks team was badass. It was a great rivalry. Chicago, New York. It's my favorite playoff series of all time. I got to put the 92 Knicks at number 7.
6.
And number 6, I'm going with the 1996 Orlando Magic. This was a damn good team. They had eliminated the Bulls the year before. Of course, Michael Jordan not really back to his normal self as a basketball player. He had added some weight for baseball, but probably also drained from the ridiculous minor league baseball schedule. I mean, if you look into the schedule and the work he was putting in as a baseball player, it was ridiculous. Well, Jordan got himself back in basketball shape. The Orlando Magic were ready and primed for a championship. They won 60 games that year, despite the fact that Shaquille O'Neal missed 28 games. What if Shaq didn't miss 28 games? How many games did they win? 70? I don't know. So, of course, you had Shaquille O'Neal, who went on to be a Hall of Famer, 15-time All-Star, 4-time NBA champion, 3-time All-Defensive Team, 3-time Finals MVP, 2-time scoring champion, and an NBA MVP. You had Penny Hardaway, who became a 4-time All-Star. He was a 3-time All-NBA player. And by the way, Penny Hardaway finished 3rd in NBA MVP voting that year, and Shaq finished 9th. You had 2 guys in the top 9 for NBA MVP voting, and again, Penny Hardaway was 3rd. Horace Grant was 8th in Defensive Player of the Year voting that year, and even with him on the court in Game 1, Bulls blew him out by 38 points. You had Dennis Scott, who finished 8th in Most Improved Player voting, and you had Shaq and Penny both average over 25 points per game in the series. And you had Dennis Scott and Nick Anderson, who were knockdown jump shooters. I believe those guys would really thrive in today's game. You know, with the lack of defense and the way guys chuck up threes like it's going out of style, how much better would this Orlando Magic team have been today? Right? They had great balance with Shaq down low, right? Who was physically imposing, could take it. I mean, look at even against Hakeem Olajuwon, he was still putting up numbers. You had Penny's dribble drive game and his post-up game. You had Dennis Scott and Nick Anderson, who stretched the defense with their outside shooting. You had Horace Grant, who was playing with the chip on his shoulder post-Bulls years. You know, he felt like he had something to prove. And guess what? The Bulls swept them! Swept them! With Michael Jordan averaging 35-5 on 52% shooting, leading the way. 2 MVP candidate level players, 2 sharpshooters, a defensive-minded big, no match for Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. So I've got the 1996 Orlando Magic at number 6. What a great team.
5.
And number 5, I'm going with the 1997 Utah Jazz. All I got to do to show you how good the 97 Jazz were, they beat the Hakeem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, and Charles Barkley Rockets 4-2 in the Western Conference Finals. They dominated the Shaquille O'Neal, Nick Van Exel, Eddie Jones, Robert Horry, and Kobe Bryant Lakers 4-1 in the semifinals. This Jazz team was really good. They were second in the NBA with offensive rating, with a 113.6 offensive rating, which is the exact same offensive rating as the 2018 Golden State Warriors. And the reason offensive rating is such an important team stat is because it adjusts for pace. It was a slower pace at the time. It was more of a grinded out type game, right? Now, it doesn't adjust for quality of defense in the league. And you know, the defense today is much worse than it was in the 90s. Anyone disputing that's out of their mind. They were also 9th in the NBA in defensive rating. You had the reigning NBA MVP and Hall of Famer Karl Malone, who became a 14-time All-Star with 4 all-defensive selections and 2 NBA MVPs. John Stockton, Hall of Famer, 10-time All-Star, 2 steals championships, 5 all-defensive selections, 9 assist titles. Jeff Hornacek was a 1-time All-Star. So you had Karl Malone, the NBA MVP that year, John Stockton, who finished 15th in MVP voting, Brian Russell, who was a defensive specialist, who took great pride in defending the best players in the NBA, which you heard him talk about in the interview that I conducted with him. And the Jazz had 4 guys in double-digit scoring in the NBA Finals. And when you got a playmaking point guard like John Stockton, he raises everyone else's level of play. So simply put, you're talking about a team with one of the absolute best power forwards of all time, one of the absolute best point guards of all time. Really tough team to beat. Scottie Pippen, he was the only other Bull to average double-digit scoring in the series. And he only shot 42% in the series, by the way. Scottie Pippen in the second three-peat, combined all those playoff games, yeah, he shot 41%. Michael Jordan, again, would put the team on his back in a tough, grinded-out type series, and he averaged 32, 7, and 6 on 46% shooting. Of course, he had the flu game, the memorable game winner in Game 1, and he led the Bulls to their 5th championship against a high-quality basketball team. So I've got the 1997 Utah Jazz at number 5. 4. At number 4, I'm going with the 1998 Utah Jazz. Oh, my gosh. How good were the 1998 Utah Jazz? Well, they beat the Tim Duncan and David Robinson Spurs 4-1, and the Spurs would go on to win an NBA championship the following year. They beat the Hakeem Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler, Kevin Willis, and broken down Charles Barkley Houston Rockets 3-2. They swept Shaq, Kobe, Eddie Jones, Rick Fox, Nick Van Exel, and Derek Fisher 4-0 in the conference finals. By the way, that was the same Lakers team that would go on to win an NBA championship 2 years later. And again, you had Hall of Famers, Karl Malone and John Stockton, right? 1-time All-Star and Jeff Hornacek, defensive specialist and Brian Russell. The Jazz won 62 games that year, despite the fact John Stockton missed 18 games. In 98, Karl Malone was runner-up to Michael Jordan's MVP, which was another very close race. John Stockton finished 13th in MVP voting. And in the series, there wasn't a single Chicago Bull who averaged 16 points per game or higher in the series. In fact, Scottie Pippen in that series, 15.7 points on 40.9% shooting. So once again, Michael Jordan had to put this team on his back. And let me say it again. They beat Tim Duncan and David Robinson 4-1. They beat Hakeem, Clyde, and Kevin Willis, and of course Charles Barkley too, even though he was broken down. Beat that Rockets team 3-2. Swept Shaq and Kobe's Lakers 4-0. And you had a broken down Scottie Pippen with a bad back who missed a number of games that year. He looked shot. He was in bad shape. And Michael Jordan said, no, I'm going to gun my way to this championship. And he did it by putting up 33.5 points per game against a team that was shutting down some great offensive players throughout the playoffs. And let's not forget the Jazz almost forced a Game 7. You all remember the sequence, though. Michael Jordan took it to the basket, got that layup, then he got the big steal on Karl Malone, and of course the epic game winner for his last shot as a Chicago Bull. It came down to that last shot. That's how great this team was. But again, Pippen was hurt, had the bad back, and Michael Jordan willed this team to another championship, his 6th championship. So yes, I've got the 1998 Utah Jazz at number 4. 3. At number 3, I'm going with the 1996 Seattle Supersonics. In my opinion, the 96 Sonics are the most underrated defensive team of all time. They were great. Now, known for their defense, they also had 3 guys average over 15 points per game in the 96 finals and 5 guys in double-digit scoring. I've often said that during the second three-peat, the formula for the Bulls' success was defense and Michael Jordan willing the team to win on the offensive end, no matter how many shots it took. And again, the game had really slowed down in the 90s, and these were grinded out style games. This was an extremely defensive-minded league. The Sonics had Gary Payton, who ended up with 9 all-defensive team selections, ended up being a 9-time All-Star. He was the Steals champion that year. The glove, of course, in the Hall of Fame, right? He was 6th in NBA MVP voting that year, and he was the Defensive Player of the Year. Pretty good year for him. Shawn Kemp, he ended up being a 6-time All-Star, and he was 8th in NBA MVP voting that year. Detlef Schrempf ended up being a 3-time All-Star, and he was coming off an All-NBA season. You had Hersey Hawkins, who was a 1-time All-Star and a deadly shooter. You had Sam Perkins, who was a good stretch big. You had Nate McMillan coming off the bench, who was the 1994 Steals champion and a 2-time All-Defensive selection guy. This Sonics team was loaded. They were the number 2 defensive team in the NBA behind the Chicago Bulls, and they were 8th in the NBA in offensive rating. Now, let's not forget this Sonics team swept Hakeem Drexler and Ori's Rockets, who were the reigning NBA champions. They beat a very good Utah Jazz team with Shawn Kemp and Gary Payton both averaging 20 points per game in the series, and you had all 5 starters in double-digit scoring in that series. Michael Jordan's sidekick, Scottie Pippen, he averaged 15.7 points per game on 34% shooting. So this was a tough, grinded-out series for Michael Jordan, but he once again willed the Bulls to the win, even though it was a struggle at times against this criminally underrated defense. But MJ got the job done, got his 4th championship on Father's Day, dedicated it to his father. So I've got the 1996 Seattle Supersonics at number 3. At number 2, I'm going with the 1992 Portland Trail Blazers. Now, the Blazers won the Western Conference in 1990. You had Danny Ainge, who was an All-Star in 88. You had Kevin Duckworth, who was an All-Star in 89 and 91. You had Cliff Robinson, who would become an All-Star in 94. Buck Williams was a 3-time All-Star and 4-time All-Defensive Player. You had Terry Porter, who was an All-Star in 91 and 93. And man, he had some great performances in the Western Conference playoffs that year. And you had the runner-up MVP candidate in Clyde Drexler, who averaged 25, 7, and 7 on 47% shooting that season. Michael Jordan, he took this one personal. He put the clamps on Clyde Drexler in the NBA Finals and held him to less than 41% shooting from the field and 15% from downtown. In fact, Michael Jordan did a better job shutting down Clyde Drexler in the NBA Finals with his one-on-one defense than the bad boy Pistons did 2 years prior, where he averaged 26, 8, and 6 on 54% shooting against the bad boys Pistons. Michael Jordan, he put up 36 points on 53% shooting and 43% shooting from downtown, while averaging 6.5 assists per game in the 92 Finals. Supporting cast, Scottie Pippen was the only other Chicago Bull who averaged more than 10 points per game. So going into the series, you had this great debate. Clyde Drexler against Michael Jordan. Clyde had a pretty good year shooting the rock from outside. He was handling a lot of playmaking duties for the Blazers, and he was the runner-up MVP, so there were a lot of people debating, is Clyde Drexler passing up Michael Jordan? Well, the answer was no. And Michael put that to rest in the finals. And, of course, the stories about Michael Jordan just taking it to Clyde Drexler and completely demoralizing him. And they had the 92 Barcelona Olympics. And in practices, Michael Jordan was going after Clyde and talking trash and just trying to demoralize him. And as the story goes, Clyde Drexler came out onto the practice court with his shoes on the wrong feet, because Michael Jordan had gotten so far into his head. That's how personal Michael Jordan took this matchup with Clyde Drexler. And also, that's how much of a competitor Michael Jordan was. He didn't just want to beat you. He wanted to demoralize you. So again, Clyde runner-up in MVP voting. Buck Williams was 6th in Defensive Player of the Year voting. I mean, this Blazers team, 7th in the NBA on offense, 3rd in the NBA on defense, a well-balanced team with a very physical brand of basketball with the likes of Jerome Kersey, Kevin Duckworth, and Buck Williams. These guys served as the physical enforcers of that team. And if you went to the basket, they let you know they were there. And then you had Terry Porter and Clyde Drexler, who were very good outside shooters. And these guys were at the peak of their career. The 92 Blazers was a great basketball team. That team got so close to an NBA championship in 90 and 92. But Michael Jordan made sure it didn't happen in 92. So I've got the 1992 Portland Trailblazers at number 2. And then at number 1, I've got to go with the 1993 Phoenix Suns. You know, the 92 Suns were pretty good. I mean, the Suns were good before Barkley got there. They had some great performances in the playoffs, and then you added Charles Barkley, and this team was ridiculous. Just ridiculous. This is a team that was putting up numbers that modern-day NBA teams put up, and teams today are doing it against much weaker defense. Now, you had 3 members of that team that played for Team USA in the Olympics and then in 94. You had Charles Barkley, who was a 92 Dream Teamer, and he was on the 96 Dream Team as well. And you had Thunder Dan Marley and Kevin Johnson, who were on the 94 Team USA, and they competed in the FIBA tournament. Now, that Suns team beat the Lakers, they beat the Spurs, and they beat the Sonics in the playoffs that year. And that Sonics team was really good. They were 2nd in the NBA in defensive rating and 4th in offensive rating. Now, the Suns had a 113.3 offensive rating that year, which is almost virtually identical with the 2018 Golden State Warriors. Charles Barkley, of course, won the NBA MVP that year, and he was on a tear in the playoffs with some huge closeout performances, hitting clutch shots, step-back jumpers, you name it. The absolute best season of his career. You had Thunder Dan Marley. That guy was a great closer, hit a number of clutch shots in his career. And you want to talk about a guy hitting threes from the parking lot. Thunder Dan did that a lot. Kevin Johnson was incredibly talented, athletic point guard, solid defender, unlike most point guards today. You had Danny Ainge, who was a solid veteran, had been an all-star in 88. Thunder Dan ended up being a 3-time all-star in his career, 2-time all-defensive team, and he was on the all-defensive second team that year behind Michael Jordan. Oh, and by the way, a lot of people don't even know this, but Thunder Dan Marley was 5th in Defensive Player of the Year voting that year. Kevin Johnson ended up being a 3-time all-star during an era just loaded with point guards. It was really hard to break through. Tom Chambers, another solid veteran, 4-time all-star. There's this misconception that teams back then couldn't play the run and gun style and, you know, the up-tempo style and jacking up threes like a lot of the modern-day teams or the modern-day Warriors or whatever have you. This team was absolutely comparable to the modern-day Warriors. The only other team more comparable is probably the Run TMC Warriors. Very, very close to that style of play. Now, a big difference between this 93 Suns team and that 91 Warriors team is this Suns team, man, you had Charles Barkley, who was just taking over basketball games. And if you're not familiar with how great Charles Barkley was that year, go watch games 5 and 7 of the Western Conference Finals to see, A, how great this Phoenix Suns team was, and B, how dominant Charles Barkley was that year. Now, going into the NBA Finals, Michael Jordan knew the 93 Suns was just an extremely potent offensive team. So he responded to that challenge by doing what? By putting up 41 points per game in the series. He raised his aggressiveness offensively and put Charles Barkley and his Phoenix Suns down for his 3rd NBA championship and 3rd NBA Finals MVP. I've got to have the 93 Suns, an amazing team that could put up a ton of points with so much talent, with Kevin Johnson and Thunder Dan at the peak of their careers, with veterans like Danny Ainge and Tom Chambers, and the tear that Charles Barkley was on that year, I've got to have the 93 Suns at number 1. Now, some of you may be saying, wow, there's a couple teams you missed on this list. No, they just missed the cut. But it goes to show you how deep the competition was during that era. So let's briefly talk about the 91 Lakers. There's some people that put blame on the 91 Lakers NBA Finals loss on James Worthy's ankle injury, but they forget that he was putting up 19 points per game on 48% shooting, and by the time he missed Game 5, the Bulls were already up 3-1 in the series. You had Vlade Divac on that team, and then people go, well, they didn't have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar anymore. He was playing at a higher level in 91 than Kareem was in the 88 or 89 finals, so that excuse doesn't fly either. You had Magic Johnson, who averaged a 26-point triple-double in the semifinals against the Run TMC Golden State Warriors that we've been talking about throughout the video. Magic Johnson was runner-up to Michael Jordan in MVP voting that year. James Worthy was a 6-time All-Star and current All-Star at that point. AC Green was 1 year removed from being an All-Star. This was a deep team that swept Hakeem's Rockets, ran through the Run TMC Golden State Warriors 4-1, beat Clyde Drexler and Terry Porter's defending Western Conference champion Blazers 4-2 in the Western Conference Finals. So yes, this was a great opponent as well. Michael Jordan ran Magic Johnson and the Lakers out of the gym while averaging 31, 7, and 11 on a ridiculous 56% shooting in the series. Another team you might be thinking that I missed, the 91 Bad Boys Pistons. No, they just missed the cut. The Pistons were the reigning NBA champions. Everybody knows who the Bad Boy Pistons were, but there's been a bunch of excuses given to this Pistons team for being swept in the Eastern Conference Finals by Michael Jordan and the Bulls. And folks, one of the biggest excuses people use for this Pistons team, they were old. Well, I guess they got old in a year. No, they were not old. Isaiah Thomas was 29 years old. Joe Dumars was 27. Mark Aguirre was 31. Dennis Rodman was 29. It's funny because Dennis Rodman was too old as a Piston, but apparently he found the fountain of youth when he was a Chicago Bull, even though clearly he was in his athletic prime as a Piston. And I believe his averages as a Bull was 5 points, 11 rebounds. Well, Jordan had a Rodman, 5 points, 11 rebounds. Yeah, as a Bull. Okay, sure. But he was old as a Piston. The team that was 1 year removed from beating the Portland Trailblazers in the NBA Finals. The team that was 4th in the NBA in defensive rating. Right? Coming off a 4-2 series win over Larry Bird's Celtics. Oh, there's another Michael Jordan excuse. He didn't beat Larry Bird. Well, damn, Larry Bird didn't beat the Pistons, or Jordan could have beat him too. Right? The Pistons had 2 All-Stars in 91 with Joe Dumars and Isaiah Thomas. 3 Hall of Famers with Dennis Rodman, Isaiah Thomas, and Joe Dumars. Joe Dumars, the 1989 NBA Finals MVP. Isaiah Thomas, the 1990 NBA Finals MVP. Apparently they got old in a year or two. They also had Mark Aguirre, who was a 3-time All-Star. And you had both Joe Dumars and Dennis Rodman on the all-defensive team that year. Oh yeah, and Dennis Rodman won the Defensive Player of the Year award that year for the 2nd straight year. Yeah, this old team that held Dominique Wilkins, a straight scorer, to 37% shooting in the first round. I'd say they were still playing at a pretty high level. In fairness to some of the excuse makers who constantly try to devalue Jordan's career, it's just, can you imagine that? They spend their whole life doing that. Some of the Pistons themselves, Isaiah Thomas, have made excuses in subsequent years for getting swept. Well, let's face it, this is the same bitter man who walked off the court, refused to shake Jordan's hand. In fact, the entire team walked off the court. And this is a bitter man that just hates Michael Jordan. Let's call it what it is. Michael Jordan made Isaiah Thomas a memory. That's what he made him in this series. He was no longer talked as being a guy right there with Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. He's now a memory. Remember when he used to be good? Oh, he was still good. He was still good. He got swept. So yeah, Michael Jordan led the Bulls to a 4-0 sweep over the bad boy Pistons in the Eastern Conference Finals while averaging 37-5 on 53.5% shooting from the floor and 60% from downtown. So yeah, Michael Jordan beat Ewing's Knicks 4 times during the championship years. We covered 2 of those teams. One of the more underrated teams that Jordan beat is probably the 97 Hawks, who were top 8 in offensive rating and top 3 in defensive rating, anchored by Dikembe Mutombo. That was a very good team. I didn't even get to teams like the 97 Bullets with Juwan Howard, Chris Webber, Rod Strickland, and a very underrated defender in Calbert Chaney. Or the 98 Hornets with Glenn Rice, Anthony Mason, David Wesley, Del Curry, and Vlade Divac. Or the 98 Nets with Keith Van Horn, Kerry Kittles, Jason Williams, Kendall Gill, and Sherman Douglas. Or how about the 91 Sixers with Hersey Hawkins, Charles Barkley, Armin Gilliam, and Rick Mahorn? Or how about the 93 Hawks with Dominique Wilkins, Kevin Willis, Mookie Blaylock, and Stacey Augmon? Or how about the 93 Cavaliers, who had an offensive rating just shy of the 2018 Golden State Warriors, with the likes of Brad Daugherty, Larry Nance, Mark Price, and Gerald Wilkins leading the way? That Cavs team was really good in the early 90s when they were healthy. There were a ton of great teams in the 90s. And the argument against the competition in the 90s, it's ridiculously ignorant. At best. There's no other way to put it. It's ignorant. So why does this argument even exist? It exists because it's an attempt, a really bad attempt if you know your NBA history, but it's an attempt to discredit everything Michael Jordan did as a champion, as a team leader, and a guy who tore up the NBA. And let's face it, it's usually coming from the pro-LeBron media and the delusional extreme LeBron James fanboys, as we call them, the 3-6 Mafia. And this is the real reason why those excuses exist. Playoff series against 50-plus win teams. Jordan, 20-7. Kobe, 25-10. LeBron, 13-10. Playoff series against 60-plus win teams. Jordan, 7-2. Kobe, 2-5. LeBron, 3-6. Hashtag 3-6 Mafia. NBA Finals games record. Jordan, 24-11. Kobe, 23-15. LeBron, 18-31. And yes, LeBron, number 2, behind Baylor and West for the most NBA Finals losses of all time. So there you go, Blitz team. The top 10 teams that Michael Jordan beat in the NBA playoffs during the championship years. And again, the 1997 Miami Heat at number 10, the 98 Pacers at number 9, the 93 Knicks at number 8, the 92 Knicks at number 7, the 96 Magic at number 6, the 97 Jazz at number 5, the 98 Jazz at number 4, the 96 Sonics at number 3. Give Seattle a team. Give them the Sonics back. The 92 Blazers at number 2, and the 93 Suns at number 1. So I hope you guys enjoyed this top 10 list, but I got to go, and I'll talk to you again soon. I'm out.